Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian in Washington, D.C., where we are at the U.S. headquarters of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. IISS every year puts out its military balance, and it's out this year. And we have with us retired Brigadier Ben Barry, who is the land warfare expert at IISS and contributed to this report. Sir, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure, Vago. How can I help?
So here's the question. What were the big developments in 2016 from a land power standpoint that you saw that's going to shape the debate and discussion in 2017?
Well, I think one of them is the war in Iraq, Syria against Daesh. Another one is the NATO-Russia land power developments, and also a growing capability for amphibious forces in the Asia-Pacific.
What are some of the specific things you saw that you think are going to be things that folks have to focus on in the coming year?
Right. For NATO, clearly they've forward deployed rotational forces now, and they're building up in the three Baltic states and Poland. And NATO's Readiness Action Plan has had some effect, lots of land exercises, the European Reinforcement Initiative, including the deployment of a US Armoured Brigade combat team. And what I think NATO armies have really got to think about is the challenge posed by a couple of Russian capabilities. One is the anti-access and area denial capabilities that can slow down NATO reinforcement and make it more difficult. But the second one is that in many respects, NATO is outgunned, outranged, and outnumbered by Russian indirect fire. The average Russian brigade has more than twice as much indirect fire as the average US and NATO brigade. And although the US and NATO have a lot of precision artillery, which is in part a response to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, in terms of dumb artillery, they're pretty much overmatched. And how they rediscover their Cold War skills of dealing with this and how they take this into account in their plans, that's going to be pretty challenging. The other part of the challenge to NATO in Eastern Europe is Russian armour. There's a lot of it's at high readiness. Tank for tank, it's not equivalent to, say, an M1 Abrams or a Leopard 2, but they are very capable systems that are widely in use around the world, and there's a lot of them. And anti-armour defence, with all the implications that has for manoeuvre, for the roles of infantry, armour and artillery, is a big issue. There's one issue on the horizon that I do wonder if NATO's taking seriously enough, and that's active protection systems on armoured vehicles. Fielded first by the Israelis, the Russians have had them for some years, but they've not been widespreadly fielded. However, the NATO reaction appears in part to have been to look at fitting active protection systems on their armour. The Dutch have announced they're fitting some on their CV-90s, the US and the UK have R&D programmes. But this is thinking symmetrically, thinking full spectrum asymmetrically. As active protection systems come online, they're going to make anti-tank missiles like Javelin and TOW, or handheld anti-armour weapons like the Swedish AT-4 in use with a lot of NATO armies. They're going to greatly reduce their effectiveness. And what I don't see in public is any evidence of NATO and Western arms manufacturers looking at how they're going to overcome that challenge.
And not many programs of record either in some of the nations except for the ones that you talked about.
Correct. Now, quite clearly, there are some great armoured vehicle manufacturing companies, and the amount of money that the US is going to spend on armoured vehicle modernisation and recapitalisation over the next decade is a significant sum of money. But what we don't see in the US and NATO are many new armoured vehicle programmes. And the only new tank programme where metal has been cut in NATO of significance is the Turkish Altay tank, which looks suspiciously like the South Korean tank. Right. But we don't see that heavy armour is of diminished importance. In fact, if you look at what's been going on in Iraq and Syria, heavy armour has been of considerable importance. Daesh have made a lot of use of captured heavy armour. And tank infantry cooperation, and also cooperation between tanks, infantry and armoured engineer assault vehicles, has been part of the successful Iraqi government forces technique of pushing Daesh out of urban areas.
You spent decades in the British Army. As a professional soldier, what are some of the lessons that you've drawn from Russian operations and operations in general in Syria? What are some of the lessons you pull that illustrate and highlight challenges for the future?
Okay, well, the first thing is the centre of gravity of where combat happens at every level, from the tactical to the operational and strategic, is where the people are, and that's urban areas. The Russian approach and the Syrian government approach to dealing with urban areas has been to use a lot of firepower, and only as a last resort to engage in close combat, infantry heavy close combat. And that reflects actually the relatively lower standard of training of Syrian forces. But we did see a few years back Hezbollah mounting battalion level dismounted close combat operations. I think what the Russian operation also tells you is the importance of synchronising air power with artillery, with land operations. In many respects, it's an interesting contrast, because the Russian-led and Iranian supported train, advise and equip operation in Syria uses a lot of firepower, but it's far less precise and far less discriminating than the US-led coalition operation to support the Iraqi government. But that may be why it's more effective. I think also there's evidence that the Russians and Syrians have sent people beyond the wire. I'll start again. There's evidence that the Russians and Iranians have sent advisors beyond the wire. You know, the Iranians have had officers killed in Syria, including some senior officers. The US model of support to Iraq, of course, has very discriminating application of air and missile firepower and the occasional soft raid. But in terms of rapid effect, its effect has been less rapid. Now, it may be that it's going to leave a less toxic political legacy in Iraq, but we have seen these two very contrasting models.
Let me ask you also mentioned amphibious operations. What are some of the amphibious operations of note or amphibious developments you've seen, and how you think that's going to be shaping thinking going forward?
Well, in Europe, of course, Russian anti-access and area denial systems, particularly submarines and coastal defence missions, probably greatly constrain NATO's ability to bring amphibious power to bear in the Baltic. But what we see in the Asia-Pacific is an upwards arrow in amphibious capability. And two examples: Australia has assigned one of its battalions to have an amphibious capability. It's procuring amphibious ships, and also US Marines are being forward based in Australia, which provides an excellent opportunity for capacity building. We've also seen the Japanese forming amphibious forces much along the line of the US Marine Corps, which is obviously driven by their dispute with China about islands in the East China Sea. The other thing you've got to remember about the Asia Pacific is, Southeast Asia is an archipelago. The archipelago is challenged with earthquakes, with tsunamis, with volcanic eruptions. It's on the typhoon zone. So when it comes to humanitarian and disaster relief, amphibious shipping is an extremely useful asset to be able to bring to bear on this.
Let me ask you one last question. One of the debates that's ongoing, certainly in the United States, as there looks like there's going to be more money, we're not sure how much more money, but everybody's convinced there will be more money. And so there's a debate in Army and Marine Corps circles about, do we get much larger in terms of people, or focus more on acquisition programs? Obviously, both General Milley and General Neller, the Chief of Staff of the United States Army and the Commandant of the Marine Corps, respectively, have both said readiness is their number one challenge. But the Army has made it clear it wants significantly more people. The Marine Corps moved this number up to 194 as a target for its size. In this environment, is size more important than capability? Or, if you were doing some of the planning or you were doing some of the recommending, where would you be suggesting that money go? Well,
size is a part of capability, and clearly equipment and organisation is part of capability, but also growing the people so you've got capable, confident people and can sustain, for example, a cyber career branch, which both the Army and the Marine Corps, in their regular and their reserve components, are very keen to grow. And it's understandable that both service chiefs want to grow in a way that's sustainable. There's not much sense in, say, growing an extra brigade combat team, an extra regimental combat team, if you haven't got enough experienced leaders, for example, to be the company commanders. I think they will want to fill in some equipment gaps, and they'll also want to exploit new equipment that's coming on stream. For example, the V-22 Osprey for the Marine Corps, their aspirations for a new amphibious combat vehicle, and the Army's recapitalisation of its armoured vehicles. And I would imagine also that they're in conversations with their scientists, their intel people, and their equipment specialists about what are the clear and present threats that they've got to create equipment capability to counter.
But wouldn't it be also a challenge, as the Commandant of the Coast Guard told me, we have to be careful about growing too big to ensure that the money, if it's a short uptick, you don't end up with more people than you can sustain over the long term.
I think he's absolutely right. I mean, my experience of the British Army is when it was forced to grow too fast, it didn't turn out frightfully well. And indeed, the growth spurts it had while I was serving, there was great emphasis on growing in a balanced way that was properly resourced. Because, of course, when you look at somebody like a company commander or a command sergeant major, or say a warrant officer electronic warfare specialist, it takes 15 or 20 years to grow those people. Now, that shouldn't be an excuse for not doing things, but if you want to minimise the risks attendant in too rapid growth, you've got to do it carefully, and you've got to make sure that what the US Army call all the .mil PF factors are properly aligned. So the caution that one hears from the Army Chief and the Commandant of the Marine Corps, in my view, is quite understandable.
Obviously, the incoming administration wants NATO to be doing more on counterterrorism, but there are those who look at what NATO does as a strategic deterrence mission. How delicate is that balance? How important, if you were doing the engineering, how would you balance the importance of focusing on counterterrorism as conventional land power to deter Russia, for example?
Well, they are both important. The other dimension, Vago, which is uncomfortable for some NATO countries, is that it's the Eastern European countries and countries like Germany and France that are really worried about Russia's assertive behaviour and its prospective threat to Eastern Europe. But the southern NATO countries, it seems to me their number one strategic priority is the migration crisis, the threat of overspill from instability in the Maghreb, and they're looking like that. Now, the US obviously has an interest in the whole of Europe being stable and, if you like, in both of NATO's strategic directions. But some of those southern European countries, say Spain and Italy, they've got some uncomfortable choices. Now, one of the strengths of NATO is that it does have a political function, and this is precisely what the North Atlantic Council is designed for NATO countries to discuss.
Sir, thanks very, very much, and best of luck on the rollout.
Thanks, Vago.